The work of the UN Development Program is being challenged by increasing humanitarian crisis and conflicts. I sat down with UNDP's Administrator Achim Steiner to talk about his agency's mandate in a divided world. I'm Frank Uciardo, and you're watching TRT World One-on-One. Achim Steiner, you are the Administrator for the UN Development Program, and thank you very much for joining us here on TRT World.
Very pleased to be here. Thank you.
This year is new at the United Nations, with the General Assembly being preceded by a very important Summit of the Future. Tell us more about really what that meant and what the outcome was.
Well, to many it may seem counterintuitive at a time when the world has such difficulty in talking to each other, in cooperating with each other. Indeed, in many places we are turning on each other and turning guns towards each other. So some would say this is not a good moment to have a summit of the future, but in fact it is precisely the moment when the United Nations and the Secretary General stepped out in front of the world and said, when things are not going well, this is when the United Nations needs to bring countries together. Let us remind ourselves on how many issues we need one another for, on how many things we can agree. And those who will say, look, the declarations, the pact for the future that came out of this summit is not a vision for the future. No, at the moment it is a reflection of what countries can agree on they need to work together on. And if you read the pact, perhaps you would be surprised. Countries recognize that, we cannot solve cybercrime, we cannot deal with the risk of the next pandemic, or climate change, or migration, or poverty, or conflicts individually. So multilateralism, the idea that we need a shared vision of the future as a way out of this moment in time, is actually very much alive. Then there is another outcome of this summit that many would never have expected 10 years ago. We have a digital compact, and I think many would never have expected 10 years ago that the world would turn to the United Nations as a platform around which countries can cooperate in this digital era, and also with the advent of artificial intelligence. And yet that's precisely what has happened, because the world needs a multilateral platform to deal with this extraordinary transformational technology. The guardrails, the parameters, the ways that we can cooperate with each other in this digital and global ecosystem have essentially been agreed here at the summit.
But, talking about the guardrails of technology, of course you're aware that with every new gadget and increasing technology, new AI, there's also its misuse by terrorists, right?
And precisely that is one of the reasons why countries have to cooperate with one another. Let me give you a very simple example. Cyber security, cyber crime has revealed itself as one of the great Achilles heels, even in the most wealthy and technologically sophisticated countries, because we live in a global digital ecosystem. The country with the weakest legislation, with no institutions, no regulatory framework, no capability to deal with cyber criminals, becomes the Achilles heel to everyone. This is why also in UNDP we are investing so much of our energy and focus now in helping countries to realize that the digital era is a transformative era for development, but also in terms of new threats, new risks, but also opportunities.
I think also, speaking of digital again, I guess a lot of people would be looking for the UN's guidance in employing soft power with these new technologies and the messages behind that, right?
Well, and what is soft power? It is the opposite of raw power, hard power, in a world that currently spends $2,400 billion on defense budgets. We are putting a lot of money in hard power, and it has taken us into an age where we have more wars, more refugees, more disasters happening across the world than since the Second World War. So soft power is also the opportunity of countries to cooperate, to invest together, and to put inclusion and equity, for instance with technology, at the center. We know that digital technology and AI and all that it will offer us in the future can be an extraordinary pivot for development in every region of the world. Just to remind you, in Rwanda today, there is a drone airport outside of Kigali where within 30 minutes any rural health clinic can order emergency medicines or blood for transfusions, and it will be delivered by drone to that health center. This is the digital technology platform, and some people might say, oh, but this is science fiction. No, it's a country that embraced innovation, but also the access to healthcare, and combine it with the digital infrastructure and new technology.
How many billions of people on this planet are affected by conflict, and that leads to the instability we see in so many countries?
I think by now we can say billions, either directly or indirectly. I mean, just to give you one sense, last year 120 million people had to flee the place they call home due to conflict. And that is a terrible number when we consider that this is essentially people having to leave their families, their heritage, everything they own. They become either internally displaced people or refugees and are at the mercy, so to speak, of the generosity and the solidarity of others. But that's just one number. As the United Nations Development Programme, it pains me today to look at how much development, infrastructure and progress is being destroyed by conflicts, whether you look to Sudan, whether you look to the conflict around Israel and Gaza now that is beginning to affect Lebanon as of this week. We can also go further. Just the impact of that conflict on an economy such as Egypt, for example, with the Red Sea and the Suez Canal essentially no longer functioning at the level that Egypt had projected for its own economic development, the kind of revenues it would generate. These are the ripple effects on all the economies, on development, on citizens, and essentially on governments being able to cope with a pressure to go backwards. And I think from that point of view, we are at the moment in an urgent need of coming out of this perspective that somehow confrontation with your neighbor is a shortcut to solving a problem. It's not.
What about financing? One of the things we've heard some of the speeches today is financing for the future, rescuing certain nations from debt servicing because it's robbing them from making progress and taking care of their people.
Well, we know that finance is the lifeblood, so to speak, of every economy, and yet since the pandemic, and particularly following the pandemic with the high interest and then increasingly high debt levels that have led in over 50 countries to the health and education budget lines being raided in order to service interest payments for foreign debt. That is the level to which the financing crisis is affecting now hundreds of millions of people, often the poorest countries, the most vulnerable communities. And our international financial system is awash with finance. There is no issue about lack of finance, but where it is accumulating, who it is benefiting, and how it is not being deployed to solve problems is increasingly leading to ruptures in our international community. That's why the Secretary General puts such an emphasis on a reform of the international financial architecture, to also address the fact that we need the private sector, private capital, that is still the vast majority of the financial players in the world, to also have the incentives but the commitments to invest in solving problems, whether it's climate change, whether it's infrastructure development, whether it's digital inclusion. And I think there are extraordinary opportunities that lie out there, but we need to align these efforts. At the moment, we are too often operating at cross purposes. The Summit of the Future was an unapologetic call also to the international financial system, including some of the international financial institutions, to reform themselves and to make themselves more relevant to both the nature of the challenge of today, but also the scale. This is not an era for development aid projects. This is an era for co-investment, and on a scale that will allow 8 billion people to actually solve these problems rather than get stuck with them.
Now, this isn't only this week and at the Summit of the Future. You were making this message back to the G20 earlier in the spring, weren't you?
Very clearly, I have the privilege to represent on behalf of the United Nations, the Secretary General of the UN, in the Finance Ministers and Central Bank Governors track. And I have repeatedly said that the G20 has been a crucial stabilizer of our international financial system and the global economy. It's 80% of the global economy that these G20 nations represent. But on the issue of debt, indebtedness, and dealing with this problem that so many poorer countries are facing right now, the G20 has been wanting. It has not acted rapidly enough and on a scale enough, which is why we see so many countries now having to essentially divert money that they would invest in their people, in development, to simply servicing international debt. And on top of that, let's also be clear, the majority of the debt that is owed today is actually held by private sector creditors. And they have very elegantly stayed away from these tables around which we have tried to find a solution to this. In moments like this, you cannot just sit back. You have to step up, and therefore also the call to the private sector, including the credit rating agencies. This is our international financial system. To step up and take a look at how on earth can we live in a world where we still have hundreds of millions of people that go hungry every night, over 700 million people who don't even have access to electricity, and I could go on with these numbers. They are solvable problems, but not if essentially those who have the resources simply look to places where they can make a quick return. We need to invest in development, sustainable development, and yes, governments need to create also the right incentives, regulatory frameworks, good governance. All this is part of it. But I think there is as much here to be done for governments as there is also for the private sector.
In closing, during the UN High-Level Week, there's so many different agendas that are being put forth and sent out to the world in different messages. What's the most important thing for the UNDP to let people know coming out of this high-level week where really their focus is on war and conflict and what's breaking in the Middle East and Ukraine?
You know, it's difficult to sometimes find a single message, but I would say my own interpretation of the mission and mandate of UNDP is hope. Development is about hope. It's about the future. It's about the opportunities that lie ahead. You sometimes start from a very dark place. This very institution, the United Nations, was thought of and conceived of in the darkest moments of the Second World War. And I think in the way that we look forward, we should realize that we live in a very contradictory moment of reality. On the one hand, so much is going wrong. On the other hand, we live in an age of possibility that is almost without precedent. And I think this is where we need to refocus the international community on things on which we actually agree. The summit of the future, this outcome of the pact, gives you a wonderful summary on all the things in which we have a shared interest in advancing together despite our differences. And that will always be the challenge for the United Nations, how to bring countries together despite their differences. And it's as true in my work every day across the world in 170 countries, alongside countries, to look for the things that unite a society and where progress is possible while you try and resolve the conflicts.
I think you just made an elegant case for the people who are critics of the UN to say, is it still relevant?
Well, if you were here today, you would see it. This morning I was in the General Assembly Hall. I actually stood together with the Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Bhutan, and we turned around and we looked at this room and we said, isn't it extraordinary? In this hall, every country, all 193 member states of the United Nations are represented. Everybody will have to listen to each one speak. Every country has the same number of seats and the right to be heard. And this is an extraordinary place. That is why even when we lose our ability to talk to each other anymore, we can still meet in these halls here. We may not always come up with a magic solution, but it's a lot better than simply going to war.
Achim Steiner from the UN Development Program, thank you for joining us here on TRT World.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Sir.
Thank you.